just said to Margaret as I came up there, I shouldn't get you to introduce me because her introductions are too good. You should never have a warm-up act that's better than you. But it's lovely, really lovely to be here back in Neilson, and thank you all for being here, which I think is officially, and I'm going to lose you, Margaret, here and lose some others, but I think officially last week was designated as the best place in the whole of Scotland to live, so that's the people who live in Neilston applauding, and everybody else thinking, how do I buy a house there? Margaret, what a formidable woman Margaret is, not just in the East End of Glasgow, but all across Scotland. And as I joked a few weeks ago, I don't know what she does to the Tories, but she sure scares the hell out of me when she's in full flow. But as Margaret said, I won the election here with a great team way back in 1997. And no one gave us any chance whatsoever. I'd only ever had one Labour predecessor, a man called Robert Nicholl, back in the 1920s. Way back in the 1920s was the last time this seat was ever held by a Labour politician. But because we had the ideas, the energy and the teamwork, we won that election back then, and we've won ever since. But I never take it for granted. I remember winning in the faces of local party members who had campaigned against the Tories locally for all those years, some going back, like David here. When did you join the Labour Party, David?
70 years ago.
70. Like David Arthur, who joined the Labour Party 70 years ago. Wow. And had never known a Labour victory in his own constituency, way back to the 1920s. But because we had the energy, the ideas, the plan, and the team, we won. But above all, what I remember from all those years ago was the feeling of possibility that came from having ended 18 years of Tory rule. Some people, of course, are driven by the anger they feel at the impotence of opposition, the long years watching as governments who don't share our interests or values get it wrong all over again. And of course, I, like you, feel that anger about the last 5 years and this Tory government. But I'm much more motivated by the feeling of hope and possibility that comes from being able to use power, and to use that power, not just to frustration, but to use that power to help working people. And that's what I want to talk about today. Not just about why we have to win, but what we'll do after winning. Because in Scotland, we are desperate for change, aren't we? We know that the last few years haven't been good enough. We know that we can do much better than this. Tens of thousands of Scots now rely on the charity to feed themselves and their families. Working people finish their shifts and head straight to a food bank because their wages don't provide for their families. Too many parents now miss a meal so they know that their children can be well fed. This hardship is real life for far too many families, but it affects us all, whether we're poor or whether we're prosperous. Our whole country is diminished when our neighbours have to go without food. And we can do better than an economy where working people cannot provide for their own family. So respect for those hard-pressed working-class families is reason enough to vote for change. But in homes around Scotland, tens of thousands of people also sit late at night or early in the morning watching their phones, waiting for the text or the phone call to tell them whether they have work the next day or that morning. People who work for the same firm week after week, month after month, don't get a contract. They don't get the certainty and they don't have the security. They're left hanging on the phone, waiting to get a text or a call to tell them whether they're needed. We can do better than a labour market where workers who are committed to their employers are left living temporary lives waiting at the end of a telephone. And we can do better than a Prime Minister who says in one TV debate he couldn't live on a 0 hours contract, but says in the next debate, never mind 0 hours contracts. A faith in a fairer Prime Minister is a reason why we need to vote for change. Because David Cameron is the 0 hours Prime Minister for whom time is now running out. And in our NHS accident emergency departments around the country, thousands of patients wait for far too many hours. NHS workers care for them as if they were members of their own family. But there isn't simply enough NHS staff for them to cope. We can do better than a government, with NHS has missed A&E waiting time targets this week, last week, and for the last 285 weeks in a row. So a love of our NHS is a reason why we need to vote for change. And in our schools, too many children will never get the opportunity to find out who they can actually be. Actually, it's not that. Too few children will get the chance to find out who they actually really are. Just 220 children from the poorest households across our country get the grades to go to our best universities. So our nation invests in those young people who continue to learn academically who go on to an apprenticeship. But those who don't are either abandoned with 140,000 Scottish college places cut and job opportunities few and far between. We can do better than this. But the next generation, we have to believe in them. We have to believe in that they will have more opportunities than their parents. So the optimism of youth is ground down too quickly into a sense of hopelessness. And optimism for our young people is also a reason why we need to vote for change on May the 7th. And across Scotland and across Britain, while living standards have fallen, social mobility has stalled and austerity hurts the poorest. Of course, not everyone has had a hard time or a bad time, and it'd be wrong to pretend otherwise. While pursuing an economic plan which is first, last, and always about cuts, the Tories have somehow managed to find £3 billion to spend on tax cuts for the highest earners. The empty shops on many of our high streets that once held cherished local businesses have been filled by payday lenders who seem to be one of the real growth industries in Tory Britain. And inequality has grown, with the top 10% earning 10 times more than the bottom 10%. That holds us all back. Inequality is estimated to have cost us about 10% off of our economic growth in just one generation. So we can do better than that as well, and that's a reason to vote for change on the 7th of May too. Now, some of these problems that I've described are the fault of the Tories. Of course they are. But some of them are also the responsibility of the SNP. And of course, if we're going to be open, some of these problems in our country are things that we should have and could have done more about in our years in government. But the fact that we now want more change doesn't mean we didn't make big changes when we were last in power, because we did. From peace in Northern Ireland and delivering a Scottish Parliament, to workers' rights and the minimum wage, we made a crucial and permanent difference. And we should always be proud of the things that the last Labour government achieved. But we can always do more. We're restless for that change because Labour is now, as we have always been, the real party of social justice. To paraphrase a former leader of ours, Jim Callaghan, we may never reach the promised land, but we will never stop marching towards it. So when we look at Scotland and see our amazing talent and potential, but we see things that stop people from fulfilling their dreams and their ambitions too. We share in what the Scottish people know. We know that Scotland and the rest of the UK can do so much better than this. The question is, how do we achieve it? We can vote out of anger. We can vote out of protest. Or we can vote with a real sense of hope for real and meaningful change. It's easy to ride a wave of anti-politics feeling, to tell scunnered voters that politicians are all the same, and it makes no difference who you vote for because the government always wins. After 5 years of this rotten Tory government, many voters can be forgiven for believing that things can never get better. But we need to fill those voters with a sense of hope, to remind them how quickly things can change. Just imagine how different things would have been if the Labour Party had been the biggest party after the last election. The cynics in this election want us to believe that 5 years of Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling would have just been the same and no different from 5 years of David Cameron and George Osborne. The truth is that Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling would never have engaged in the hurtful, poverty-creating, confidence-sapping, NHS-threatening austerity that we've seen over the past 5 years, and people should never forget that. Because we know that Scotland can't afford 5 more years of David Cameron and his Tory austerity. But the truth is, any of us can tell us what's wrong with our country. This election isn't just about that. It isn't just about a coherent explanation about all the things that's wrong with our two governments. It has to be about how we put it right. Who has the best plan? And who is best placed to deliver the change that can improve our country? So I want to share with you this morning further details of Labour's plan, what we will do to make that change. Our starting point is that Scotland succeeds when working families succeed. So I want to go through some details of our plans this morning. We will raise the national minimum wage to at least £8 an hour and support a living wage. We want a decent hourly rate, but we also want people to have regular hours so that they can support their families. So we will abolish the exploitative zero-hours contracts that leave families with insecure incomes. We want people's wages to go further. So we will tackle the cost of living with a cap on rent rises, a freeze on energy bills, and a tax on legal loan sharks, and support more affordable credit. But even those out of work should be able to feed their kids. So we will end, clearly and once and for all, those loathsome, punishing, Job Centre Plus DWP targets upon the poor and the unemployed. It's just unacceptable in a country as rich as ours that people who are out of work and down in their luck get sanctioned and don't even know about it, and they go to the hole-in-the-wall machine to try and get £10 out to pay the food bill or something else, and there's no money in their account because they've been sanctioned. I had a man come to see me a few weeks ago who had his benefit stopped because he didn't go and sign on because he was at a job interview. Now, what type of welfare state do you get punished for going for a job interview rather than going to sign on? And yet they're told in the hole in the wall that they have no money, so where do they go? They can't go to friends, they can't go to relatives, so they go to unaffordable credit of high street moneylenders, and they get involved in a vicious cycle not of their fault, but of this government's making. So we'll go further. We'll also end the bedroom tax that's forced families out of the homes in which they were born and which they've spent their entire lives. So together, this adds up to a Labour plan to tackle poverty, and we will also go much further than that. I'm sickened by the immorality of people having to feed their children by charity and food banks. But again, this is one of those issues where you can describe the problem or address it, and Labour will address it. We will uniquely, unlike any other political party, we will invest £175 million to end the need for food banks in Scotland once and for all. And we want to do more. We want to bring that sense of hope in our young people so that they can do even better than their parents. So we have a £1 billion plan to guarantee a better future for the next generation. Labour will tax the bonuses of bankers to guarantee a job or training for all young Scots. Labour will keep tuition fees free, and we will guarantee the poorest students an extra £1,000 on their bursaries. And because Labour is the party and the only party of social justice, we will never forget the majority who don't go to university. So we will invest the equivalent of those free tuition fees. £1,600 a year is what we pay in the average higher education tuition fee in Scotland. So we will give that £1,600 to every 18 and 19-year-old in the shape of a future fund who isn't in college or university or an apprenticeship. That's a £1,600 future fund to invest in training, to start up a business, or whatever it takes to unlock a better future. It's wrong when those youngsters who don't go to college or university but go to work and they pay their taxes in the world of work. And at that age, probably their mum or dad is out working, paying their taxes. And at that age of 18 or 19, it's conceivable even their grandparent or grandparents might still be out working. So we're one, perhaps 2 or even 3 generations of that family are out working and paying taxes. It's wrong that they should be ignored. They're paying into the system, and the system shouldn't ignore them, which is why every 18 and 19-year-old person in Scotland who isn't in college or university will uniquely have that £1,600 from a Labour government. But we want to go further than that in a sense of social justice. We want the NHS to be guaranteed to be there when people need it, to have the resources to deliver new cures and to meet the challenges of an ageing population. So we will tax the profits of the tobacco companies, make sure that hedge funds pay their fair share, and yes, we will bring in a mansion tax to those most expensive properties found, of course, mostly in London and the South East, to invest an additional £1 billion in our National Health Service. That enables us to deliver in Scotland. For starters, what we've announced is there will be 1,000 more NHS nurses in Scotland because of the mansion tax. Now, we recognise that all this change is only possible with an end to the crushing Tory austerity that has failed working people and has failed in its own purpose, which is to pay down the debt. So we will be honest that someone has to pay. So we say to the wealthiest, well done for your success, but we need you to contribute a little bit more. Through the mansion tax, the banker's bonus tax, the tax on tobacco companies, changes to tax relief and pensions for the most wealthy, and the 50p tax rate for those on over £150,000 a year. We will change those tax arrangements to raise the money that's needed to pay for the society in which we believe. Labour will make sure that Scotland will get her fair share of these extra resources, because as we deliver more powers for our Parliament, giving us the final say over benefits, we will, today, tomorrow and forever, keep the Barnett formula, which shares resources and guarantees us higher spending here in Scotland. So these are our 10 priorities. 1,000 extra nurses for our NHS, funded by a mansion tax. Secondly, more powers for the Scottish Parliament, including the final say on benefits. Third, a guarantee of a job and training for all young people. Fourth, £1,600 for 18 and 19-year-olds who don't have an apprenticeship, go to college or go to university, so that they can invest in themselves. Fifthly, we will raise the minimum wage to over £8 an hour. Sixth, we will guarantee the Barnett formula to deliver billions of pounds more for our schools, hospitals and pensioners. 7, we will increase the bursaries for the poorest students by £1,000. 8, no tuition fees in Scotland's universities. 9, ban exploitative 0 hours contracts. And 10, end the need for food banks with £175 million to tackle the causes of poverty. You know, some people used to say, Some people used to say that they didn't know what the Labour Party in Scotland stood for. They can be in no doubt any longer. Because any of those 10, by themselves, is reason enough to have a Labour government. Any of those 10 ideas is reason enough to go out on May the 7th and vote for the only social justice party in Scotland. But all 10 together, and the many other issues they will unveil in our manifesto, shows the world of a difference between the Labour Party and a Tory party, and shows just what's at stake on the 7th of May. And this is a plan for change, as I will explain, that Scotland will only see if we vote for Labour. I will get to the politics of that in a moment, but the nationalist policy is one that risks the progress that I'm talking about. Do you know, I give the SNP credit for being clear that this election isn't about independence. They are clear that they are standing and arguing for full fiscal autonomy within the United Kingdom. Where they are wrong is claiming that this policy is what the people of Scotland were promised in the vow. The vow, the Smith Agreement, and everything Labour said could not have been clearer. We promised to keep the Barnett formula, and we will keep the Barnett formula. But keeping that Barnett formula that provides billions of pounds more for Scotland and for Scots is entirely incompatible with the SNP policy where only taxes raised in Scotland would fund public services in Scotland. So no mansion tax for the NHS, no bankers' bonus for tax on bankers' bonuses to create youth jobs, no pension relief changes to invest in higher bursaries for Scottish students or for the £1,600 youth fund. The independent experts at the IFS looked at the nationalist policy of full fiscal autonomy within the UK and concluded that far from ending Tory austerity, it meant an additional £7.6 billion of cuts or tax rises. We know that apart from the 50p commitment, where they finally moved after months of challenge from Labour, the SNP don't support any of the other tax rises and tax changes that I've spoken about today. So their plan would leave £7 billion cuts to Scotland's budget. Even the SNP's own economic advisor, Jim McCall, says that the policy would leave Scotland with a fiscal gap. Their candidate in Edinburgh East honestly said that it's only a theoretical gap in funding for our schools and hospitals. Do you know it's only theoretical if Labour win the election? Presumably, their candidate means it's only a theoretical until their policy becomes real. Little wonder then that in the Scottish Parliament on Thursday, the First Minister couldn't even bring herself to utter those three little words, well, two little words and one longer word, full fiscal autonomy. But Scotland will hear an awful lot more about full fiscal autonomy in this campaign, even if it's not from the SNP. The Nationalists started this campaign promising more powers and an end to austerity. Now, they can't even publicly support their own policy on more powers because it will end this sense of the Barnett formula and create more austerity. The SNP have an abundance of confidence in all things except their own major policy. So the SNP's policy of full fiscal autonomy cannot deliver and would not deliver an end to the austerity and change that Labour's plan would. Our plan would bring in an extra £800 million a year to Scotland, but we need a Labour government to help it deliver that. And it is far from clear whether the SNP really want a Labour government at all. The First Minister says she sees no real difference between a Labour government and a Tory government. Do you know, those workers stuck in those exploitative zero-hours contracts, those parents who go to work and don't earn enough to put food on the table for their wains, Those people who are stuck in ever longer A&E queues at NHS hospitals. They know the difference between a Labour and a Tory government, even if the SNP don't. And they said they'll bring down a Labour government. And they've said they don't want people here or elsewhere in the UK to vote for the Labour Party. Of course the SNP want people in Scotland to vote SNP. That's why they exist. But they also urge people in Wales not to vote Labour. In Wales they urge a vote for Plaid, and in England they urge a vote for the Green Party. Don't know how they support the oil and gas industry in Scotland while urging a vote for the Green Party in England, but that's an inconsistency for another day. Look, we can argue about the finer points of the constitutional process, but one thing is unarguable. We don't get a Labour government without people voting for a Labour Party. Now, of course, we've been and seen this before. Back in 2010, as a Scottish Labour Prime Minister sought re-election, the SNP leader at that time told voters across the UK to vote anyone but Labour again. They said vote SNP in Scotland, Plaid in Wales, pretty straightforward. But that time round, they said vote Lib Dem in England. Do you know, some people got a Lib Dem MP, but we all got a Tory PM. And we shouldn't let that happen again. Labour was the second biggest party. I was in the cabinet. We tried to form a government. But the political reality was that the biggest party was in the strongest position. Now, the SNP counter all of that experience by arguing that it's nowhere in any rule book is it written that the biggest party has to form the government. It might not be written in a rule book, but it is written in our history books. Never in our history as a modern democracy, in more than 20 modern elections, has anyone other than the biggest party gone on to form the government after the election. It's a huge gamble to vote in this election in the expectation that this time it will be any different. For years we heard the SNP argue that it was people in England that voted to give Scotland a Tory government. Now Labour is ahead in Wales, in all the cities of the north of England, and the polls suggest that we are far ahead in London. It would be deeply ironic, would it not, if the only people in the UK that stood in the way of a Labour government were SNP MPs here in Scotland. Now, it's my responsibility, it's all of our responsibility to turn the polls round, to convince people to vote for change, to vote for Labour, and to make Scotland a partner with London, Liverpool, Cardiff in kicking out the Tories. And it's the SNP's job, apparently, now to stop that from happening. Our case is that the change that we need is too big. The choice between our parties is too large, that we cannot take a chance on change this time. The way to guarantee change, to guarantee that this failed Tory government is sent packing, of course, is only with a vote for Labour. Now, the decision that we take on the 7th of May will decide the future of Scotland for many years to come. So I want to reflect finally on one last idea. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform the life chances of Scotland's young people. We should grasp it with both hands. We shouldn't look back in anger afterwards and think what might have been the day after the election. In Stuart Lansley's and Joanna Mack's book called Breadline Britain, which is a shocking, really shocking insight into the nature of poverty in our country, they quote interviews with families struggling to raise their kids without enough money to even provide the basics for them. The book closes with a quote from a parent describing her ambitions, which has stayed with me, and I thought I'd share it with you today. She said, "The dreams for my children is for them to be happy, to be comfortable, see that they have a good job and they can go on their merry ways and enjoy their life. That's my dream, to have a good job and go on their merry ways and enjoy their life." What struck me wasn't just the honesty of that quote, but how reasonable this mother's ambitions for her kids is. Her dream is, I believe, it isn't too much to ask for. It's not even a dream in many people's minds. It's the very least that she should be able to expect from a society and an economy as rich as ours that she lives in. For me, that's the greatest indictment of Tory Britain, that for too many people, their ambition is simply to get by. I think we can do better than that. I know for a fact that we can do much better than that. A Scotland and a Britain where families don't just survive, they don't dream just to get by. Now that mother, some people might not enjoy it in politics in Scotland, but that mother lived in South London. But she could easily have been on the south side of Glasgow. Because people across Britain, people on the south side of every city, need a Labour government. We can be part of a really progressive alliance, a coalition of Labour MPs elected in the cities of the north, in the industrial heartlands of the English Midlands, in the valleys of Wales, in inner city London, and the cities, towns and villages all across Scotland. Scotland, we can't beat the Tories alone, but the rest of the UK can't do it without us. That work of change begins on the morning of the 8th of May, when a Labour government starts to change our country and our economy. But for that to happen, the day before, we have to vote for the only party that is big enough, the only party that is strong enough to defeat the Tories and to end their crushing austerity. Let's go and do that together. Thank you very much.